I don't remember when the whisper began, only that it never sounded like a voice, not exactly. It was softer than that, like the echo of a thought that didn't belong to me, curling around the edges of my reflection every time I looked in the mirror. The first night it happened, the city outside was half asleep, rain tracing quiet lines down the glass of my apartment window. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, still wearing my work shirt, collar slightly wilted, tie loose around my neck. My face looked tired, ordinary, someone I was used to ignoring. That's when I noticed her. Not behind me, not beside me, but within the mirror, my reflection almost but not quite aligned, smiling faintly when I wasn't. "You could look different," she whispered.
It startled me.
I blinked hard, but the smile stayed for half a second longer than it should have, like a glitch in a movie frame. I told myself it was exhaustion. I'd been working late shifts, skipping meals, barely sleeping. But something in me, a quiet, forgotten part, leaned forward instead of stepping back. I touched the edge of the mirror.
Cold. Real.
My pulse echoed in my fingers. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about that version of me, how her smile had seemed knowing, almost kind. I dreamt of silk and light, of unfamiliar softness brushing against my skin, of laughter that wasn't mine but felt like home. When I woke, the sheets were tangled around me like a cocoon, my heart racing as if I'd been caught doing something secret. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it. But the whisper returned, gentler this time, when I buttoned my shirt before work. "Why hide it?" she asked. "Hide what?" I almost said aloud, but I couldn't find the answer. It became a rhythm over the following days. I'd catch glimpses of something, my reflection tilting her head when I didn't, lips curling into a knowing smirk, eyes warmer than mine. Each time, she said a little more. Not in words exactly, but in feelings, in the way my chest tightened when she looked at me. It was as though she was showing me something I'd buried long ago. Then came the moment I couldn't deny her anymore. It was a Friday night. The city hummed with neon and noise beyond my balcony. I had no plans, just the dull companionship of takeout and the glow of my laptop. But when I opened my dresser to grab a shirt, something unfamiliar caught my eye, a folded piece of delicate fabric that I didn't remember owning. Pale lavender. Lace along the edges. My first thought was absurd, that someone had planted it there. But I lived alone. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations, while another part, quieter but stronger, recognized it immediately. It felt almost familiar. My hands trembled as I held it up. That's when I heard her again, the whisper cutting through the static hum of the city. "Try it. You'll remember." It wasn't command or temptation. It was almost compassionate, as though she knew how heavy the air had become inside me. I told myself I wouldn't, that it was insane, that I was being manipulated by my own exhaustion. But I couldn't put it down. The fabric felt impossibly soft between my fingers, the color catching the low light like dawn trapped in silk. And in that moment, something inside me cracked, not broken, but opened. I wasn't thinking when I closed my eyes and breathed in, the whisper settling over me like warmth. It wasn't about clothes or gender or even rebellion. It was about truth, something I hadn't dared to look at for years. Something that now stared back at me through the glass, smiling, patient, waiting for me to stop pretending. When I looked up again, my reflection wasn't smiling anymore. She was simply watching, tender, knowing, unafraid. And for the first time, I didn't flinch. Threads of her voice. The weekend passed in a strange quiet. The city outside roared with its usual noise, car horns, laughter, the murmur of strangers beneath my window, but inside, my apartment felt sealed off, suspended in a different kind of time. I moved through it carefully, like an intruder afraid to disturb the air. The lavender fabric still lay folded on the dresser, where I'd left it. Each time I walked past, I felt a pull toward it, a whisper under the skin that wasn't quite thought or feeling, but something in between. I tried to ignore it. I cleaned, scrolled through messages, half-heartedly answered emails. But it was there, patient, watchful. That night, the whisper returned. "You're not seeing what I see," she said. I turned toward the mirror. My reflection looked the same, of course, tired, ordinary, wearing an expression that didn't belong to me anymore. I felt foolish for answering aloud. "And what do you see?" Her eyes softened, as if she pitied me. "Someone trying to disappear." The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. For a long time, I'd thought of myself as someone who endured quietly, blending in, never asking questions that might draw attention. But hearing it said like that, even if it was only in my mind, made it sound like an accusation. "I'm not disappearing," I whispered back. She smiled faintly. "Then stop hiding." I didn't know what she meant until I glanced again at the lavender cloth on the dresser. My throat tightened. There was something unbearably fragile about it, not because it was delicate, but because it knew too much. Like it carried memories I hadn't yet remembered. That night I dreamed again. I was standing in the same room, but everything shimmered faintly, like light seen through water. The walls breathed softly, and in the center of the mirror stood the same woman, my reflection, yet not. She moved closer until we almost touched, her expression calm but urgent. "When you stop fighting me," she said, "you'll start hearing clearly." When I woke, the city was still asleep. A faint gray light bled through the blinds. My heart was racing, though I didn't feel afraid. I felt called. Without quite realizing it, I found myself standing before the dresser again. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded the fabric, tracing the edges as if trying to recall something half-remembered from childhood. The mirror caught my movement, framing it in silver. I could see both of us now, the hesitant man standing in the soft morning light, and the calm, knowing woman reflected before him. There was no accusation in her eyes this time, only patience. I didn't move for a long time. I simply stood there, breathing, listening to the hum of the city waking up, feeling that silent exchange between the two of us. Something shifted that morning. Subtle, but irreversible. It wasn't defiance or surrender. It was something quieter, like forgiveness. For the first time, I felt a kind of truce with myself, as though the boundaries between who I'd been and who I was becoming had blurred just enough to let light through. The whisper came once more, but softer now, almost tender. "Good. Now we can begin." And just like that, the world seemed to tilt, the air thinning with a strange calm. I didn't know what I was beginning, only that I couldn't turn back anymore. The shape of the silence. For days after that morning, everything I did felt slightly out of sync, as if reality were one heartbeat behind me. My routine hadn't changed. The same morning coffee, the same walk through the city's noise, the same elevator rides filled with polite silence, yet each moment seemed to carry an invisible echo. Sometimes, I'd catch my reflection in shop windows, and for a flicker of a second, I'd see her again, the version of me who wasn't pretending. Her posture softer, her eyes alive with a calm confidence I didn't yet possess. It wasn't haunting anymore. It was almost comforting, like she was watching over me. At work, I sat through meetings half listening, nodding at words that barely registered. I could feel the edges of something inside me pressing outward, restless to be seen. I wasn't sure what to call it, only that pretending to be invisible was suddenly exhausting. That evening, as twilight slipped between the city towers, I found myself drawn once more to the mirror. Not the bathroom one this time, but the tall standing mirror in my bedroom, the one I usually avoided because it showed too much. The whisper was gone. Or maybe it had changed form. No longer something I heard, but something I felt, rising from beneath my ribs like a heartbeat. I studied my reflection, searching for the faint traces of that other self. My hair looked wrong, my shoulders tense, my eyes tired. But then I remembered her words, "Stop hiding." It was strange, how those two words carried more weight than years of quiet denial. I tried something small. I brushed my hair differently, just enough to change the frame of my face. It wasn't dramatic, but it felt deliberate. As I looked up again, the difference startled me. The mirror seemed to lean closer, approving, as though it had been waiting for me to make that tiny act of acknowledgement. I smiled. Just a little. The reflection smiled back, but not mockingly, warmly, almost proudly. That night, I didn't dream of her. I dreamt of light. Not bright light, but the kind that drifts through curtains on early mornings, soft, forgiving. It filled the room, tracing every surface until even the smallest things, a hairbrush, a half-read book, a forgotten cup of tea, seemed to hold meaning. When I woke, I felt calm. Not because everything made sense, but because it didn't have to. There was a quiet acceptance in simply being, in letting the questions breathe instead of silencing them. Later, as I stood by the window watching the city stir awake, I realized the whisper hadn't disappeared at all. It had simply moved inward, becoming a part of me. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the silence it left behind. The echo between faces. The first time I noticed the change wasn't in the mirror, it was in the way people looked at me. It happened one morning on the train. The same dull commute, the same quiet hum of tired strangers lost in their phones or thoughts. I caught my reflection in the window's glare and realized I was sitting differently, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, as if the space I occupied no longer needed permission. Across from me, a woman smiled, faintly, for no reason I could understand. Maybe she saw something familiar in me, or maybe it was nothing more than coincidence. But it lingered. That smile followed me through the day, like a thread tugging me quietly towards something invisible. At work, my coworkers spoke to me with a different kind of ease. Not that they'd been unkind before, just distant, polite. Now, their tone softened, their eyes held a flicker of warmth. I hadn't changed anything about my appearance that they could see, but something had shifted in how I existed. Confidence, I told myself. Or maybe honesty, the kind that doesn't need words. That evening, the sky turned silver with a thin mist of rain. I walked home without an umbrella, letting the drops cling to my hair and coat. The city lights blurred into soft halos through the moisture, and for once, I didn't feel alone among them. I felt accompanied by the rhythm of my own footsteps, by the pulse of something quiet but certain awakening inside me. When I reached my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights right away. The darkness was gentle, familiar. I stood in front of the mirror again, the faint glow of the street lamps painting both of us, me and her, in a dim, forgiving light. She was there, of course. My reflection, calm and knowing. "You're learning," she whispered. Her voice was quieter now, almost human. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," I admitted. "You already are." The simplicity of it made me tremble. I wanted to believe her, to believe that transformation wasn't about sudden revelation but slow, patient truth. That maybe becoming yourself wasn't a destination, but a rhythm you learned to move with. For a long time, I just looked at her. I saw the fear still flickering beneath my calm expression, but also the strength, a quiet kind that didn't announce itself, only waited to be noticed. Then she smiled, not in triumph, but in recognition. "Now you're beginning to see me as you." The lights from the city caught in the glass, turning our eyes the same shade for the briefest second. And in that fleeting reflection, something aligned, not fully, but enough to feel the balance returning between who I was and who I was learning to be. When I finally stepped away from the mirror, the whisper faded, replaced by something deeper, a sense of peace that didn't need explanation. Outside, the rain kept falling, and for once, it sounded like music. The city beneath the skin. I began noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. The way light clung to glass windows, the way strangers carried themselves, the small symphonies of movement that made the city feel alive. Everything seemed sharper, more deliberate, as though the world had quietly rearranged itself overnight. But I knew it hadn't.
It was me.
The change wasn't visible to anyone else, not really. Yet I could feel it, a softness in my gestures, a gentler rhythm to how I spoke, even the tone of my laughter when I allowed myself to forget to be guarded. It wasn't performance. It was honesty finally finding its way through hesitation.
People responded to it.
At the coffee shop I visited every morning, the barista greeted me by name for the first time. At work, a colleague I'd barely spoken to before began joining me for lunch, chatting about films and books as if the wall between us had always been imaginary. The world hadn't suddenly become kinder. I'd just stopped hiding from it. Still, when I returned home each evening, I'd stand in front of the mirror, waiting. She no longer appeared as an echo out of sync with my reflection. She was there only when I truly looked, and when she did appear, her expression mirrored mine perfectly.
Calm. Certain.
I began to think of her less as the mistress and more as the truth I'd spent my life postponing. She was not commanding me. She was guiding me, and sometimes that guidance came in silence. One night, I found myself writing in a notebook, not a diary exactly, but fragments of thoughts, questions, and memories. It wasn't about clarity, it was about release. Why was I so afraid to be seen? What would happen if I stopped pretending? Who was I before I learned to perform? Each word felt like untying a knot that had lived too long beneath my ribs. I didn't realize I was crying until the ink blurred on the page. When I lifted my head, the mirror across the room reflected the faintest glimmer of movement. Not a person, not even a shape, just the shimmer of recognition, like the air itself was alive with approval. "I'm proud of you," the whisper said, barely audible. I smiled through the tears. "You sound different tonight. So do you." The words lingered, echoing softly around the room until even the silence began to feel full of things unspoken, yet entirely understood. It was strange how transformation could be so quiet. No thunder, no lightning, just the steady sound of one heart learning a new rhythm. That night, as I drifted toward sleep, I thought about how much of life is spent pretending to be solid, when in truth, we're all just shifting shapes of light and memory, reflections waiting for recognition. And for the first time, I didn't dread the morning. A different kind of morning. The next morning felt different before I even opened my eyes. There was no sudden revelation, no voice calling out from the mirror. Just light, soft, golden light filtering through the blinds, stretching across the room as if to wake me gently. The world felt slower, kinder. For the first time in a long while, I didn't dread the day ahead. I moved through my small apartment quietly, noticing details I'd always ignored. The faint scent of coffee grounds, the way the sun touched the edges of the framed photographs on the wall, the rhythm of traffic far below. Everything seemed newly alive, as though I were meeting the city again after years apart. When I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, I didn't see her, the other me, the whispering figure who had once haunted my nights. But I could feel her, not as a presence outside of me, but as something within, like a steady pulse guiding me forward. I smiled to myself. "You're still here," I murmured. And in the stillness, it was as if the air smiled back. At work, I began to speak more, not louder, just more honestly. When someone asked for my opinion, I gave it without the usual self-censorship. When people laughed, I joined in without wondering whether I was supposed to. It was small, unremarkable things, but together they felt revolutionary. There was a strange freedom in not performing. The walls I'd built, out of fear, expectation, habit, didn't crumble dramatically. They simply stopped being necessary. One afternoon, during lunch, my coworker Anna asked if I was all right. "You seem different lately," she said, stirring her coffee. "Happier, maybe?" I hesitated before answering. "Just tired of pretending, I guess." She looked at me for a moment, then nodded, a knowing softness in her eyes. "That's a good kind of tired." Her words stayed with me long after we returned to work. That evening, I walked home through the dusky light, feeling the city's hum blend with my heartbeat. For so long, I had thought transformation meant becoming someone else. But now I understood it was about uncovering who had always been waiting beneath the noise, the quiet, unguarded self who didn't need permission to exist. When I reached home, the mirror waited as it always did. I stood before it without hesitation. My reflection was steady, unthreatening, familiar. No voice came this time. No whisper. No command. Just silence. And the deep, unwavering sense that silence could be its own kind of conversation. I touched the glass lightly, leaving a faint mark where my fingers met their reflection. It wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a reminder. "You don't need me anymore," I heard, not with my ears, but somewhere deeper. And though I couldn't see her, I knew she was smiling. The quiet mirror. Weeks passed, though time felt softer now, less like a clock ticking and more like a rhythm unfolding. The changes in me no longer felt dramatic, they were subtle, like the way light shifts through a room as the day moves forward. Yet people noticed. I laughed more easily. I spoke with a steadiness I hadn't known before. My reflection no longer felt like a stranger I was trying to imitate. And still, there were moments of doubt. Some mornings I'd wake with the old ache, the reflex to hide, to shrink, to second-guess the peace I'd found. But instead of fighting it, I began to listen. Doubt, I realized, was not an enemy. It was a teacher. It asked questions I had avoided all my life. One of those mornings, I sat by the window, coffee cooling beside me, the city a living map of sound and motion outside. I found myself writing again. This time, not questions but truths. I used to think transformation was about becoming someone new, but it's really about becoming whole. I stared at those words for a long time, feeling their weight settle gently inside me. That evening, the mirror called me again, not with whispers, but with quiet presence. I stood before it, tracing my reflection with my eyes as though seeing a friend return home after a long journey. "You kept your promise," I thought. No answer came, yet I felt a warmth rise through me. Not pride, exactly, but something deeper. Acceptance. For the first time, I realized that she, the mistress, the reflection, the whisper, had never been someone separate. She had always been the part of me that refused to die, the voice that had waited patiently for me to stop hiding. I placed my palm against the glass, feeling the coolness meet the heat of my skin. "Thank you," I whispered. The faint hum of the city answered through the walls, blending with the silence between us. When I turned away, I didn't feel her absence. I felt her within, a quiet certainty in my steps, a clarity in my breath. Outside, the evening air smelled of rain and beginnings. And as I walked through it, I realized that maybe the mirror had never been a portal or a symbol. Maybe it was simply what it had always been, a surface reflecting truth, waiting for me to look long enough to recognize it. The world without walls. The first time I truly felt free was on an ordinary afternoon. Nothing monumental happened, no revelation, no miracle. I was walking home from work, the sun dipping low between the buildings, and suddenly the city felt mine. The sound of footsteps, the scent of roasted coffee drifting from a nearby cafe, the low hum of traffic, everything seemed woven together in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. For the first time in years, I wasn't watching myself from a distance. I was simply there, part of it all. It struck me how much of my life I had spent trying to be unseen. Every gesture measured, every word softened to fit the expectation of others. But now, as I moved through the evening crowd, I realized how much of the world opens when you stop shrinking inside it. People met my eyes more often. Some smiled. And I smiled back, not as performance, but as connection. At home that night, I opened the window wide and let the sound of the city drift in. The mirror across the room reflected only darkness and scattered light. I didn't need to look into it anymore to find her. She was everywhere, in my voice, in my posture, in the quiet steadiness that no longer trembled under doubt. I sat by the window and watched the streets below, remembering how afraid I'd been to take up space in my own life. How I'd believed that peace was something I had to earn by becoming someone else. But the truth had always been simpler. Peace isn't earned, it's allowed. The next morning, I did something small but monumental. I met my reflection with a smile before leaving for work. No searching, no questioning. Just acknowledgement. And in that moment, I felt it, the merging. There was no longer a separation between the self that lived inside and the one that moved through the world. The mistress, the whisper, the reflection, all of her lived in me now, not as a guide or a ghost, but as a quiet knowing. The world felt bigger that day, and I moved through it without fear. Every glance from a stranger, every echo of laughter on the street, Every ray of light against glass felt like an invitation to live fully. I no longer needed a mirror to see who I was becoming. I could feel it in the steadiness of my steps, in the lightness in my chest, in the stillness that followed me wherever I went. And maybe that was what freedom really was, not escape, but arrival. The shape of belonging. I started noticing how differently I moved through familiar places. The cafe where I used to stand in line with my head down had become a place where I lingered, talking with the barista about the weather or the music that played over the hum of machines. On the train, I no longer counted the stops. I watched the faces, the shifting expressions of people lost in thought, and felt a strange kinship with them. Everyone, I realized, was carrying some version of themselves they were still learning to accept. The world hadn't changed. I had. One afternoon, as I sat on a park bench watching children chase each other through falling leaves, a quiet thought surfaced. I used to live like a ghost. It wasn't self-pity. It was recognition. The ghost had been a defense, a way to survive invisibility. Now, that part of me was dissolving, replaced by something weightier, human. I took out my notebook, the same one filled with scattered reflections, and wrote only a single line. I am no longer waiting for permission. When I closed the cover, I felt the simplest, purest kind of relief. That evening, at home, I stood before the mirror again. It no longer felt like a ritual. It was a reunion. The reflection that met my eyes was not perfect, but real, alive, grounded, unmistakably me. I remembered how it began. The whisper, the fear, the lavender light that had once seemed foreign. Now all of it felt like memory, part of the same journey that had carried me here. I think I understand now, I said softly. The reflection smiled. It was my own smile. There was no voice this time, no echo. Just the quiet certainty that nothing essential had been lost. Outside, the city shimmered with evening lights. In every reflection on every window, I saw pieces of myself, fragments scattered through the world, finally belonging to the same whole. I didn't need to hide. I didn't need to explain. I simply existed, and that was enough. The morning after the rain. The night before the end felt like any other. The city outside hummed, soft rain tapping against the window, and I sat beside it with my notebook open but blank. There was nothing left to write. The questions that had once burned in me had become answers I no longer needed to ask. When I finally slept, I dreamt not of mirrors, not of voices, but of light, pale and endless, the kind that makes everything shimmer with possibility. And in that dream, she was there, not as a reflection, but as a memory of warmth, smiling with the kind of pride that belongs to someone who knows their work is done. "You don't need me anymore," she said again. "I know," I replied, and the words didn't hurt this time. When I woke, the rain had stopped. The world outside was clean and new, the streets shining as though someone had polished the entire city overnight. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching people begin their day, the same endless motion of lives intersecting and moving on. Only this time, I didn't feel apart from it. I was part of the rhythm, part of the quiet music that filled the spaces between sound. For a moment, I turned toward the mirror. My reflection waited patiently, just as it always had. We looked at each other, not as strangers, not as fragments, but as one. I smiled first. She smiled back. And there was no whisper, no echo, no difference between the two. In that silence, I understood, transformation had never been about becoming someone else. It was about returning, to honesty, to wholeness, to the self that had been waiting all along beneath the noise. The city moved outside my window. I finished my coffee, and for the first time, I stepped out the door without wondering who I was supposed to be.